stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about blue-blooded mama's boy Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones is swept overboard during a South Seas voyage for his lifelong ill health. Washed ashore on an uncharted South Pacific island, desperately tries to survive. Attacked by a tribe of cliff dwellers and saved by a cave princess, Nadara. His bookish education has not prepared him to cope with these surroundings, and he is a coward. She teaches him the language, how to swim, how to fish, and basic woodcraft, as he begins to realize that he does not know everything. Nadara warns him that a newcomer to her tribe must fight the strongest men, who have killed many. When they reach her home village, he is horrified to see that despite her appearance, her tribe seems to be cavemen from the Paleolithic era. In order to avoid death at the hands of the tribal bullies, he vanishes. Can he survive all the danger of this jungle island, and what about Nadara? Is there any hope of ever leaving and being saved? At last came the morning for departure. Rising with the sun, Waldo took his morning tub in the cold spring that rose a few yards from his cave. Then he got out the razor that the sailor had given him, and after scraping off his scanty, yellow beard, hacked his tawny hair until it no longer fell about his shoulders and in his eyes. Then he gathered up his weapons, rolled the boulders before the entrance to his cave, and turning his back upon his rough home set off down the little stream toward the distant valley, where it wound through the forest along the face of the cliffs to Flatfoot and Court. As he stepped lightly along the hazardous trail, leaping from ledge to ledge in the descent of the many sheer drops over which the stream fell, he might have been a reincarnation of some primeval hunter from whose savage loins had sprung the warriors and the strong men of a world. The tall, well-muscled, brown body, the clear, bright eyes, the high-held head, the sword, the spear, the shield were all a far cry from the weak and futile thing that had lain groveling in the sand upon the beach, sweating and shrieking in terror 6 short months before. And yet it was the same. What one good but mistaken woman had smothered another had brought out, and the result of the influence of both was a much finer specimen of manhood than either might have evolved alone. In the afternoon of the third day Waldo came to the forest opposite the cliffs where lay the home of Nadara. Cautiously he stole from tree to tree until he could look out unseen upon the honeycombed face of the lofty escarpment. All was lifeless and deserted. The cave mouths looked out upon the valley, sad and lonely. There was no sign of life in any direction as far as Waldo could see. Coming from the forest he crossed the clearing and approached the cliffs. His eye, now become alert in woodcraft, detected the young grass growing in what had once been well-beaten trails. He needed no further evidence to assure him that the caves were deserted, and had been for some time. One by one he entered and explored several of the cliff dwellings. All gave the same mute corroboration of what was everywhere apparent: the village had been evacuated without haste in an orderly manner. Everything of value had been removed, only a few broken utensils remaining as indication that it had ever constituted human habitation. Waldo was utterly confounded. He had not the remotest idea in which direction to search. During the balance of the afternoon he wandered along the various ledges, entering first one cave and then another. He wondered which had been Nadara's. He tried to imagine her life among these crude, primitive surroundings, among the beast-like men and women who were her people. She did not seem to harmonize with either. He was convinced that she was more out of place here than Flatfoot would have been in a Back Bay drawing room. The more his mind dwelt upon her the sadder he became. He tried to convince himself that it was purely disappointment in being thwarted in his desire to thank her for her kindness to him, and demonstrate that her confidence in his prowess had not been misplaced, but always he discovered that his thoughts returned to Nadara rather than to the ostensible object of his adventure. In short, he began to realize, rather vaguely it is true, that he had come because he wanted to see the girl again, but why he wanted to see her he did not know. That night he slept in one of the deserted caves, and the next morning set forth upon his quest for Nadara. For 3 days he searched the little valley, but without results. There was no sign of any other village within it. Then he passed over into another valley to the north. For weeks he wandered hither and thither without being rewarded by even a sight of a human being. Early one afternoon, as he was topping a barrier in search of other valleys, he came suddenly face to face with a great, hairy man. Both stopped, the hairy one glaring with his nasty little eyes. "I can kill you," growled the savage. Waldo had no desire to fight, it was information he was searching. But he almost smiled at the ready greeting of the man. It was the same that Sag the Killer had accorded him that day he had gone down to the sea for the last time. It came as readily and as glibly from these primitive men as good morning falls from the lips of the civilized races, yet among the latter he realized that it had its counterpart in the stony stares which Anglo-Saxon strangers vouchsafe one another. "I have no quarrel with you," replied Waldo. "Let us be friends." "You are afraid," taunted the hairy one. Waldo pointed to his sable garment. "Ask Nagula," he said. The man looked at the trophy. There could be no mightier argument for a man's valor than that. He came a step closer that he might scrutinize it more carefully. Full-grown and in perfect health, he grunted to himself. "This is no worn and mangy hide peeled from the rotting carcass of one dead of sickness." "How did you slay Nagula?" he asked suddenly. Waldo indicated his spear, then he drew his garment aside and pointed to the vivid, new-healed scars that striped his body. "We met at dusk at a cliff top. He was above, I below. When we reached the bottom of the ravine, Nagula was dead. But it was nothing for Thander. I am Thander." Waldo rightly suspected that a little bravado would make a good impression on the intellect primeval, nor was he mistaken. "What do you here in my country?" asked the man, but his tone was less truculent than before. "I am searching for Flatfoot and Court, and Nadara," said Waldo. The other's eyes narrowed. "What would you of them?" he asked. "Nadara was good to me, I would repay her." "But Flatfoot and Court, what of them?" insisted the man. "My business is with them. When I see them I shall transact it," Waldo parried, for he had seen the cunning look in the man's eyes and he did not like it. "Can you lead me to them?" "I can tell you where they are, but I am not bound thither," replied the man. 3 days toward the setting sun will bring you to the village of Flatfoot. There you will find Court also, and Nadara," and without further parley the savage turned and trotted toward the east. Chapter 8 Nadara again. Waldo watched him out of sight, half-minded to follow, for he was far from satisfied that the fellow had been entirely honest with him. Why he should have been otherwise Waldo could not imagine, but nevertheless there had been an indefinable suggestion of duplicity in the man's behavior that had puzzled him. However, Waldo took up his search toward the west, passing down from the hills into a deep valley, the bottom of which was overgrown by a thick tangle of tropical jungle. He had forced his way through this for nearly half a mile when he came to the bank of a wide, slow-moving river. Its water was thick with sediment, not clean, sparkling, and inviting, as were the little mountain streams of the hills and valleys farther south. Waldo traveled along the edge of the river in a northwesterly direction, searching for a ford. The steep, muddy banks offered no foothold, so he dared not venture a crossing until he could be sure of a safe landing upon the opposite shore. A couple of 100 yards from the point at which he had come upon the stream he found a broad trail leading down into the water, and on the other side saw a similar track cutting up through the bank. This, evidently, was the ford he sought, but as he started toward the river he noticed the imprints of the feet of many animals, human and brute. Waldo stooped to examine them minutely. There were the broad pads of Nagula, the smaller imprints of countless rodents, but back and forth among them all were old and new signs of man. There were the great, flat footprints of huge adult males, the smaller but equally flat-footed impresses of the women and children, but one there was that caught his eye particularly. It was the fine and dainty outline of a perfect foot, with the arch well defined. It was new, as were many of the others, and, like the other newer ones, it led down to the river and then back again, as though she who made it had come for water and then returned from whence she had come. Waldo knew that the tracks leading away from the river were the newer, because where the two trails overlapped those coming up from the ford were always over those which led downward. The multiplicity of signs indicated a considerable community, and their newness the proximity of the makers. Waldo hesitated but a moment before he reached a decision, and then he turned up the trail away from the river, and at a rapid trot followed the spoor along its winding course through the jungle to where it emerged at the base of the foothills, to wind upward toward their crest. He found that the trail he was following crossed the hills but a few yards from the spot at which he had met the caveman a short time before. Evidently the man had been returning from the river when he had espied Waldo. The young man could see where the fellow's tracks had left the main trail, and he followed them to the point where the man had stood during his conversation with Waldo. From there they led toward the east for a short distance, and then turned suddenly north to re-enter the main trail. Waldo could see that as soon as the man had reached a point from which he would be safe from the stranger's observation he had broken into a rapid trot, and as he already had 2 hours' start Waldo felt that he would have to hurry were he to overtake him. Just why he wished to do so he did not consider, but, intuitively possibly, he felt that the surly brute could give him much more and accurate information than he had. Nor could Waldo eliminate the memory of those dainty feminine footprints. It was foolish, of course, and he fully realized the fact, but his silly mind would insist upon attributing them to the cave girl, Nadara. For 2 hours he trotted doggedly along the trail, which for the most part was well defined. There were places, of course, which taxed his trailing ability, but by circling widely from these points he always was able to pick up the tracks again. He had come down from the hills and entered an open forest, where the trail was entirely lost in the mossy carpet that lay beneath the trees, when he was startled by a scream, a woman's scream and the hoarse gutturals of 2 men, deep and angry. Hastening toward the sound, Waldo came upon the authors of the commotion in a little glade half hidden by surrounding bushes. There were 3 actors in the hideous tragedy, a hairy brute dragging a protesting girl by her long, black hair and an old man, who followed, protesting futilely against the outrage that threatened the young woman. None of them saw Waldo as he ran toward them until he was almost upon them, and then the beast who grasped the girl looked up, and Waldo recognized him as the same who had sent him toward the west earlier in the day. At the same instant he saw the girl was Nadara. In the brief interval that the recognition required there sloughed from the heart and mind and soul of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones every particle of the civilization and culture and refinement that had required countless ages in the building, stripping him naked, age on age, down to the primordial beast that had begot his first human progenitor. He saw red through blood as he leapt for the throat of the man-beast whose ruthless hands were upon Nadara. His lip curled in the fighting snarl that exposed his long unused canine fangs. He forgot sword and shield and spear. He was no longer a man, but a terrible beast, and the hairy brute that witnessed the metamorphosis blanched and shrank back in fear. But he could not escape the fury of that mad charge or the raging creature that sought his throat. For a moment they struggled in a surging, swaying embrace, and then toppled to the ground, the hairy one beneath. Rolling, tearing, and biting, they battled, each seeking a death hold upon the other. Time and again the gleaming teeth of the once fastidious Bostonian sank into the breast and shoulder of his antagonist, but it was the jugular his primal instinct sought. The girl and the old man had drawn away where they could watch the battle in safety. Nadara's eyes were wide in fascination. Her slim, brown hands were tight-pressed against her rapidly rising and falling breasts as she leaned a little forward with parted lips, drinking in every detail of the conflict between the 2 beasts. Ah, but was the yellow-haired giant really fighting for possession of her, or merely in protection, because she was a woman? She could readily conceive from her knowledge of him that he might be acting now solely from some peculiar sense of duty which she realized that he might entertain, although she could not herself understand it. Yes, that was it, and when he had conquered his rival he would run away again, as he had months before. At the thought Nadara felt herself flush with mortification. No, he should never have another opportunity to repeat that terrible affront. As she allowed her mind to dwell on the humiliating moment that had witnessed the discovery that Thander had fled from her at the very threshold of her home, Nadara found herself hating him again as fiercely as she had all these long months, a hatred that had almost dissolved at sight of him as he rushed out of the underbrush a moment before to wrest her from the clutches of her hideous tormentor. Waldo and his antagonist were still tearing futilely at one another in mad efforts to maim or kill. The giant muscles of the caveman gave him but little if any advantage over his agile, though slightly less powerful, adversary. The hairy one used his teeth to better advantage, with the result that Waldo was badly torn and bleeding from a dozen wounds. Both were weakening now, and it seemed to the girl who watched that the younger man would be the first to succumb to the terrific strain under which both had been. She took a step forward and, stooping, picked up a stone. Her small strength would be ample to turn the scales, as she might choose a sharp blow upon the head of either would give his adversary the trifling advantage that would spell death for the one she struck. The two men had struggled to their feet again as she approached with raised weapon. At the very moment that it left her hand they swung completely round, so that Waldo faced her, and in the instant before the missile struck his forehead he saw Nadara in the very act of throwing upon her face an expression of hatred and loathing. Then he lost consciousness and went down, dragging with him the caveman, upon whose throat his fingers had just found their hold. Chapter 9: The Seeker. When the old man saw what had happened he ran forward and grasped Nadara by the wrist. "Quick!" he cried, "quick, my daughter! You have killed him who would have saved you, and now nothing but flight may keep Court from having his way with you." As in a trance the girl turned and departed with him. They had scarcely disappeared within the underbrush when Waldo returned to consciousness, so slight had been the effect of the blow upon his head. To his surprise he found the caveman lying very still beside him, but an instant later he read the reason for it in the little projecting ridge of rock upon which lay his foe's forehead. In falling the savage man had struck thus and lost consciousness. Almost immediately the hairy one opened his eyes, but before he could gather his scattered senses sinewy fingers found his throat, and he lapsed once more into oblivion, from which there was no awakening. As Waldo staggered to his feet he saw that the girl had vanished, and there swept back into his mind the memory of the hate that had been in her face as she struck him down. It seemed incredible that she should have turned against him so, and at the very moment, too, when he had risked his life in her service, but that she had there could be no doubt, for he had seen her cast the stone with his own eyes. He had seen her, and, too, he had seen the hatred and loathing in her face as she looked straight into his. But what he had not seen was the look of horror that followed as the missile struck him instead of Court, sending him crumpling to earth. Slowly Waldo turned away from the scene of battle, and without even a second look at his vanquished enemy limped painfully into the brush. His heart was very heavy and he was weak from exhaustion and loss of blood, but he staggered on, back toward his mountain lair, as he thought, until unable to go further he sank down upon a little grassy knoll and slept. When Nadara recovered from the shock of the thing she had done sufficiently to reason for herself, she realized that after all Thander might not be dead, and though the old man protested long and loudly against it, she insisted upon retracing her steps toward the spot where they had left the yellow giant in the clutches of Court. Very cautiously the girl threaded her way through the maze of shrubbery and creepers that filled the intervening space between the forest trees, until she came silently to the edge of the clearing in which the two had fought. As she peered anxiously through the last curtain of foliage she saw a single body lying quiet and still upon the sward, and an instant later recognized it as Court's. For several minutes she watched it before she became convinced that the man who had so terrorized her whole childish life could never again offer her harm. She looked about for Thander, but he was nowhere to be seen. Nadara could scarcely believe that her eyes were not deceiving her. It was incredible that the yellow one could have gone down to unconsciousness before her unintentional blow and yet have mastered the mighty Court, but how else could Court have met his death and Thander be gone? She approached quite close to the dead man, turning the body over with her foot until the throat was visible. There she saw the finger marks that had done the work, and with a little thrill of pride she turned back into the forest, calling Thander's name aloud. But Thander did not hear. Half a mile away he lay weak and unconscious from loss of blood. Morning found Nadara sleeping in a sturdy tree upon the trail along which Waldo had followed Court. She had discovered the footprints of the two men the evening before while she had been searching unsuccessfully for the trail which Waldo had followed after the battle. She hoped now that the spoor might lead her to Thander's cave, to which she felt it quite possible he might have returned by another way. When the girl awoke, she again took up her journey, following the tracks as unerringly as a hound up through the hilly country, across the divide and down into the jungle to the very watering place at which her tribe had drank a few days earlier. Here she made a brief stay. Then on again down the river, back through the jungle and onto the divide once more. She was much mystified by the windings of the trail, but for days she followed the fading spoor until, becoming fainter and fainter as it grew older, she lost it entirely at last. She was quite sure by now, however, that it led from her tribe's former territory, and so she kept on, hoping against hope that soon she would come across the fresh track of Thander where he had passed her on his return journey to his home. Nadara had eluded the old man when she started upon her search for Thander, so it was that the old fellow returned to the dwellings of his people alone the following day. Flatfoot was the first to greet him. "Where is the girl?" he growled. "And where is Court? Has he taken her? Answer me the truth or I will break every bone in your carcass." "I do not know where the girl is," answered the old man truthfully enough, "but Court lies dead in the little glade beyond the 3 great trees. A mighty man killed him as he was dragging Nadara off into the thicket." "And the man has taken the girl for himself?" yelled Flatfoot. "You old thief you! This is some of your work. Always have you tried to cheat me of this girl since first you knew that I desired her. Whither went they? Quick! Before I kill you." "I do not know," replied the old man. "For hours I searched, until darkness came, but neither of them could I find, and my old eyes are no longer keen for trailing, so I was forced to abandon my hunt and return here when morning came." "By the 3 trees the trail starts, you say?" cried Flatfoot. "That is enough, I shall find them. And when I return with the girl it will be time enough to kill you, now it would delay me too much," and with that the caveman hurried away into the forest. It took him half a day to find Nadara's trail, but at last his search was rewarded, and as she had made no effort to hide it he moved rapidly along in the wake of the unsuspecting girl, but he was not as swift as she, and the chase bid fair to be a long one. When Waldo woke he found the sun beating down upon his face, and though he was lame and sore he felt quite strong enough to continue his journey, but whither he should go he did not know. Now that Nadara had turned against him the island held nothing for him, and he was on the point of starting back toward his far-distant lair from where he might visit the ocean often to watch for a passing ship, when the sudden decision came to him to see the girl again, regardless of her evident hostility, and learn from her own lips the exact reason of her hatred for him. He had had no idea that the loss of her friendship would prove such a blow to him, so that his pride suffered as well as his heart as he contemplated his harrowed emotions. Of course he was reasonably sure that Nadara's attitude was due to his ungallant desertion, for which act he had long suffered the most acute pangs of remorse and contrition. Yet he felt that her apparent vindictiveness was not warranted by even the grave offense against chivalry and gratitude of which he had been guilty. It presently occurred to him that by the traitorous attack which he believed that she had made upon him while he was acting in her defense she had forfeited every claim which her former kindness might have given her upon him, but with this realization came another humiliating thought: he still wished to see her. He, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, had become so devoid of pride that he would voluntarily search out one who had wronged and outraged his friendship, with the avowed determination of seeking a reconciliation. It was unthinkable. And yet, as he admitted the impossibility of it, he set forth in search of her. Waldo wondered not a little at the strange emotion inherent gregarious instinct, he thought it, which drew him toward Nadara. It did not occur to him that during all the past solitary months he had scarcely missed the old companionship of his Back Bay friends, that for once that they had been the subject of his reveries the cave girl had held the center of that mental stage 1,000 times. He failed to realize that it was not the companionship of the many that he craved, that it was not the community instinct, or that his strange longing could be satisfied by but a single individual. No, Waldo Emerson did not know what was the matter with him, nor was it likely that he ever would find out before it was too late. The young man attempted to retrace his steps to the battleground of the previous day, but he had been so dazed after the encounter that he had no clear recollection of the direction he had taken after he quitted the glade. So it was that he stumbled in precisely the opposite direction, presently emerging from the underbrush almost at the foot of a low cliff tunneled with many caves. All about were the morose, unhappy community whose savage lives were spent in almost continual wandering from one filthy, comfortless warren to another equally foul and wretched. At sight of them Waldo did not flee in dismay, as most certainly would have been the case a few months earlier. Instead, he walked confidently toward them. As he approached they ceased whatever work they were engaged upon and eyed him suspiciously. Then several burly males approached him warily. At 100 yards they halted. "What do you want?" they cried. "If you come to our village we can kill you." Before Waldo could reply an old man crawled from a cave near the base of the cliff, and as his eyes fell upon the stranger he hurried as rapidly as his ancient limbs would carry him to the little knot of ruffians who composed the reception committee. He spoke to them for a moment in a low tone and, as he was talking, Waldo recognized him as the old man who had accompanied Nadara on the previous day at the battle in the glade. When he had finished speaking one of the cavemen assented to whatever proposal the decrepit one had made, and Waldo saw that each of the others nodded his head in approval. Then the old man advanced slowly toward Waldo. When he had come quite close he spoke. "I am an old man," he said. "Thander would not kill an old man?" "Of course not, but how know you that my name is Thander?" replied Waldo. "Nadara, she who is my daughter, has spoken of you often. Yesterday we saw you as you battled with that son of Nagula. Nadara told me then that it was you. What would Thander among the people of Flatfoot?" "I come as a friend," replied Waldo, "among the friends of Nadara. For Flatfoot I care nothing. He is no friend of Nadara, whose friends are Thander's friends, and whose enemies are Thander's enemies. Where is Nadara but first, where is Flatfoot? I have come to kill him." The words and the savage challenge slipped as easily from the cultured tongue of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones as though he had been born and reared in the most rocky and barren cave of this savage island, nor did they sound strange or unusual to him. It seemed that he had said the most natural and proper thing under the circumstances that there was to say. "Flatfoot is not here," said the old man, "nor is Nadara. She but here." Waldo interrupted him. "Court, then," he demanded. "Where is Court? I can kill him first and Flatfoot when he returns." The old man looked at the speaker in unfeigned surprise. "Court!" he exclaimed. "Court is dead. Can it be that you do not know that he, whom you killed yesterday, was Court?" Waldo's eyes opened as wide in surprise as had the old man's. Court! He had killed the redoubtable Court with his bare hands. Court, who could crush the skull of a full-grown man with a single blow from his open palm. Clearly he recollected the very words in which Nadara had described this horrible brute the time she had harrowed his poor, coward nerves, as they approached the village of Flatfoot. And now he, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, had met and killed the creature from whom he had so fearfully fled a few months ago. And, wonder of wonders, he had not even thought to use the weapons upon which he had spent so many hours of handicraft and months of practice in preparation for just this occasion. Of a sudden he recalled the old man's statement that Nadara was not there. "Where is she, Nadara?" he cried, turning so suddenly upon the ancient one that the old fellow drew back in alarm. "I have done nothing to harm her," he cried. "I followed and would have brought her back, but I am old and could not find her. Once, when I was young, there was no better trailer or mighty warrior among my people than I, but—" "Yes, yes," exclaimed Waldo impatiently, "but Nadara. Where is she?" "I do not know," replied the old man. "She has gone, and I could not find her. Well do I remember how, years ago, when the trail of an enemy was faint or the signs of game hard to find, men would come to ask me to help them, but now—" "Of course," interrupted Waldo, "but Nadara. Do you not even know in what direction she has gone?" "No, But since Flatfoot has set forth upon her trail, it should be easy to track the two of them. Flatfoot set out after Nadara, cried Waldo. Why? For many moons he has craved her for his mate, as has Court, explained Nadara's father, but I think that each feared the other, and because of that fact Nadara was saved from both. But at last Court came upon us alone and away from the village, and then he grasped Nadara and would have taken her away, for Flatfoot was not about to prevent. You came then, and the rest you know. If I had been younger, neither Flatfoot nor Court would have dared menace Nadara, for when I was a young man I was very terrible, and the record of my kills was a. How long since did Flatfoot set out after Nadara? Waldo broke in. But a few hours since, replied the old man. It would be an easy thing for me to overtake him by night had I the speed of my youth, for I well remember. From where did Flatfoot start upon the trail? Cried the young man. Lead me to the place. This way then, Thunder, said the other, starting off toward the forest. I will show you if you will save Nadara from Flatfoot. I love her. She has been very kind and good to me. She is unlike the rest of our people. I should die happy if I knew that you have saved her from Flatfoot, but I am an old man and may not live until Nadara returns. Ah, that reminds me, there is that in my cave which belongs to Nadara, and were I to die there would be none to protect it for her. Will you wait for the moment that it will take me to run and fetch it, that you may carry it to her, for I am sure that you will find her, though I am not as sure that you will overcome Flatfoot if you meet him. He is a very terrible man. Waldo hated to waste a minute of the precious time that was allowing Flatfoot to win nearer and nearer Nadara, but if it were in a service for the girl who had been so kind to him and for the happiness of her old father he could not refuse, so he waited impatiently while the old fellow tottered off toward the caves. Those who had come halfway to meet Waldo had hovered at a safe distance while he had been speaking to Nadara's father, and when the two turned toward the forest all had returned to their work in evident relief, for the old man had told them that the stranger was the mighty warrior who had killed the terrible Court with his bare hands, nor had the story lost anything in the telling. After what seemed hours to the waiting Waldo, the old man returned with a little package carefully wrapped in the skin of a small rodent, the seams laboriously sewed in a manner of lacing with pieces of gut. This is Nadara's, he said as they continued their way toward the forest. It contains many strange things of which I know not the meaning or purpose. They all were taken from the body of her mother when the woman died. You will give them to her? Yes, said Waldo. I will give them to Nadara, or die in the trying of it. Chapter 10 The Trail's End. Soon they came upon the trail of Flatfoot in the glade by the three great trees. They had not searched for it sooner, for the old man knew that it would start from that point upon its quest for the girl. The tracks circled the glade a dozen times in widening laps until at last, at the point where Flatfoot must have picked up the spoor of Nadara, they broke suddenly away into the underbrush. Once the way was plain, Waldo bid the old man be of good heart, for he would surely bring his daughter back to him unharmed if the thing lay in the power of man. Then he hurried off upon the new-made trail that lay as plain and readable before him as had the printed page of his former life, but never had he bent with such keen interest to the reading of his favorite author as he did to this absorbing drama written in the turned leaves, the scattered twigs, and the soft mud of a primeval forest by the feet of a savage man and a savage maid. Toward mid-afternoon Waldo became aware that he was much weaker from the effects of his battle with Court than he had supposed. He had lost much blood from his wounds, and the exertion of following the trail at a swift pace had reopened some of the worse ones, so that now, as he ran, he was leaving a little trail of blood behind him. The discovery made him almost frantic, for it seemed to presage failure. His condition would handicap him in the race after the two along whose track he pursued, so that it would be a miracle were he to reach Flatfoot before the brute overtook Nadara. And if he did overtake him in time, what then? Would he be physically able to cope with the brawny monster? He feared that he would not, but that he kept doggedly to the grueling chase augured well for the new manhood that had been so recently born within him. On and on he stumbled, until at dusk he slipped and fell exhausted to the earth. Twice he struggled to his feet in an attempt to go on, but he was forced to give in, lying where he was until morning. Slightly refreshed, He ate of the roots and fruit which abounded in the forest, taking up the chase again, but this time more slowly. He was now convinced that the way led back along the same trail which he had followed into the country, and when he reached the point at which he had first met Court on the previous day, he cut across the little space which intervened between the caveman's tracks and the point at which he had stood before he went down over the divide into the jungle toward the river and the ford. A moment later he was rewarded by the sight of Nadara's dainty footprints as well as those of Flatfoot leading away along his old trail. The act had saved him several miles of needless tracking. All that day he followed as rapidly as his weakened condition would permit, but his best efforts seemed dismally snail-like. Along the way he bowled over a couple of large rodents, which he ate raw, for he had long since learned the desirability of a meat diet for one undergoing severe physical exertion, and had conquered his natural aversion for the uncooked flesh. He even had come to relish it, though often as he dined thus upon meat a broad grin illumined his countenance at the thought of the horror with which his mother and his Boston friends would view such a hideous performance. As he continued trailing the two, he was at first surprised to discover the fidelity with which Nadara had clung to his old trail, and because of this fact he often was able to save miles at a time by taking crosscuts where, on his way in, he had made wide detours. But at last, on the third day, when he attempted this at a place which would have saved him fully 10 miles, he was dismayed by the discovery that he could not again pick up either Nadara's trail or that of the caveman. Even his own old trail was entirely obliterated. It was this fact which caused him the greatest concern, for it meant that if Nadara really had been following it, she must now be wandering rather aimlessly, possibly in an attempt to again locate it. In which event her speed would be materially reduced, and the probability of her capture by Flatfoot much enhanced. It was possible, too, that the beast already had overtaken her. This, in fact, might be the true cause of the cessation of the pursuit along the way which it had proceeded up to this point. The thought sent Waldo back along his former route, which he was able to follow by recollection, though the spoor was seldom visible. He came upon no sign of those he sought that day, but the next morning he found the point at which Nadara had lost his old trail upon a rocky ridge. The girl evidently assumed that it would lead into the valley below where she might pick it up again in the soft earth, and so her footprints led down a shelving bluff, while plain above them showed the huge imprints of Flatfoot. Up to this point at least he had not caught up with her. Waldo breathed a sigh of relief at the discovery. The trail was at least 2 days old, for Nadara and Flatfoot had traveled much more rapidly than the wounded man who haunted their footsteps like a grim shadow. About noon Waldo came to a little stream at which both those who preceded him had evidently stopped to drink. He could see where they had knelt in the soft grass at the water's edge. As Waldo stopped to quench his own thirst, his eyes rested for an instant upon the farther bank, which at that point was little more than 10 feet from him. He saw that the opposite shore was less grassy, and that it sloped down to the water, forming a muddy beach partially submerged. But what riveted his attention were several deep imprints in the mud. He could not be certain, of course, at that distance, but he was sure enough that he had recognized them to cause him to leap to his feet, forgetful of his thirst, and plunge through the stream for a closer inspection. As he bent to examine the spoor at close range, he could scarcely repress a cry of exultation. They had been made by the hands and knees of Nadara as she had stooped to drink at the very spot not 24 hours before. She must have circled back toward the brook for some reason, but by far the greatest cause for rejoicing was the fact that Nadara's trail alone was there. Flatfoot had not yet come upon her, and Waldo now was between them. The knowledge that he might yet be in time, and that he was gaining sufficiently in strength to make it reasonably certain that he could overhaul the girl eventually, filled Waldo with renewed vigor. He hastened along Nadara's trail now with something of the energy that had been his directly before his battle with Court. His wounds had ceased bleeding, and for several days he had eaten well, and by night slept soundly, for he had reasoned that only by conserving his energy and fortifying himself in every way possible could he succor the girl. That night he slept in a little thicket which had evidently harbored Nadara the night before. The following day the way lay across a rolling country, cut by numerous deep ravines and lofty divides. That the pace was telling on the girl Waldo could read in the telltale spoor that revealed her lagging footsteps. Upon each eminence the man halted to strain his eyes ahead for a sight of her. About noon he discerned far ahead a shimmering line which he knew must be the sea. Surely his long pursuit must end there. As he was about to plunge on again along Nadara's trail, something drew his eyes toward the rear, and there upon another hilltop a mile or two behind he saw the stocky figure of a half-naked man. It was Flatfoot. The caveman must have seen Waldo at the same instant, for, with a menacing wave of his huge fist, he increased his gait to a run, an instant later disappearing into the ravine which lay at the bottom of the hill upon which he had come into view. Waldo was undecided whether to wait for the encounter where he was or hasten on in an effort to overtake Nadara, that she might not escape him entirely. He knew that he stood a good chance of being killed in the conflict, and he also knew that were he victorious it might easily be at such a terrible price that he would be physically incapable of continuing his search for the girl for many days. As he meditated, his eyes wandered back and forth across the landscape before him, searching for Nadara. To his right lay, at a little distance, a level plain which stretched to the foot of low-lying cliffs at the valley's southern rim, some 3 or 4 miles distant. In this direction his view was almost unobstructed, but it was not in the direction of the girl's flight, so that it was but by accident that Waldo's eyes swept casually across the peaceful scene which would, at another time, have chained his attention with its quiet and alluring beauty. It was as he swept a backward glance in the direction of Flatfoot that his eye was arrested by the hint of something far out across the valley, a little behind his own position. To the Waldo of a few months previous it would not have been visible, but the new woodcraft of the man scented the abnormal in the vague suggestion of movement out among the long waving grasses of the plain. And now, with every sense alert and riveted upon the spot, he was quick to perceive that it was an animal moving slowly toward the cliffs at the upper end of the valley. Presently a little rise of ground, less thickly grassed, brought the creature into full view for an instant, but in that instant Waldo saw that the thing he watched was a woman. As he turned to hurry after her he saw Flatfoot top another hill a half-mile nearer than he had been before, and as the caveman came into view he turned his eyes in the direction that Waldo had been looking. A second later and he had abandoned the pursuit of Waldo and was running rapidly toward the woman. Nadara had apparently circled back once more, this time from the sea, and coming up the valley had passed Waldo and come opposite Flatfoot before either of them had discovered her. The young man gave a little cry of alarm as he realized that the caveman was nearer to the girl than he, by a good half-mile, he judged, and so he put every ounce of his speed into the wild dash he made down the hill into a gully which led out upon the valley. On and on he raced, unable to see either Flatfoot or Nadara, hoping, ever hoping, that he would be the first to win to her side, for Nadara had told him of the atrocities that such a creature as Flatfoot might perpetrate upon a woman rather than permit her to escape him or fall into the hands of another. Nadara, being upwind, caught neither the scent nor noise of the two who were racing madly toward her. The first knowledge she had that she was not alone in the valley was the sight of Flatfoot as he broke suddenly through a clump of tall grass not 50 paces from her. She gave a little scream and started to run, but she was very tired from the days of unremitting flight which had so sorely taxed her endurance, and thus it was no wonder that she slipped and fell before she had taken a dozen steps. Scarcely had she gained her feet when Flatfoot was upon her, one hand grasping her by the arm. "Come with me in peace or I will kill you," he cried. "Kill me, then," retorted the despairing girl, "for I shall never come with you, first will I kill myself." Flatfoot did not wish to kill her, nor did he wish her to escape, as she would be very likely to do should he be interrupted by the fellow who must even now be quite close to them. Possibly if he could keep the girl quiet they might hide in the grass until their pursuer had gone by, and so Flatfoot, acting upon the idea, clapped a rough hand over Nadara's mouth and dragged her back along the trail he had just made. The girl struggled, striking and clawing at the hairy brute that pulled her along at his side, but she was as helpless in his clutches as if she had been a day-old babe. She did not know that help was so close at hand, or she would have found the means to free her mouth and cry out once at least. As it was, she wondered that Flatfoot should attempt to silence her in this way if there were none to hear her screams. For days she had known that the caveman was on her trail, for once in doubling back upon herself she had passed but a short distance from a ridge she had traversed the preceding day, and had seen the man's squat figure and recognized his awkward, shuffling trot. It was this knowledge that had turned her away from the old village toward which she had been traveling since she lost Thander's trail, and sent her in search of a new country, in which she might lose herself from Flatfoot. As the man dragged her roughly on through the grass, Nadara racked her brain for some means of escape, or a way to end her misery before the beast could have his way with her. But there came no ray of hope to her poor, unhappy heart. If Thander were but there, he would save her, even if it were but to desert her the next instant. But did she wish to be saved again by him? Now that she pondered the idea, she was quite sure that she would rather die than see him again, for had he not twice run away from her? In her misery she put this interpretation upon the remarkable disappearance of Thander after his battle with Court. He had waited until she was out of sight, and then he had risen and fled for fear she might return and discover him. She wondered why he should dislike her so much. She was quite sure that she had been very good to him, and had tried not to annoy him while they were together. Maybe he looked down upon her, for surely he was of a superior race, of that she was quite positive. And so Nadara was very miserable and unhappy and hopeless as the brutal Flatfoot dragged her far into the tall jungle grass. Presently she noticed that the caveman repeatedly cast glances toward the rear. What could he expect from that direction, or from any direction whatever, so far as that was concerned? Were they not days and days from their own people, in a land where there seemed no men at all? Flatfoot heard no sign of pursuit. He was growing more confident. The stranger had lost their trail. The caveman moved less rapidly, and as he went he looked now for a burrow into which he might crawl with the maiden. Then there would be no further danger whatever. Tomorrow Flatfoot would come out and find the fellow and kill him, but now he had pleasanter work in view, nor did he wish to be disturbed. And at that very moment he caught a stealthy movement in the grasses a few yards to his right. Waldo had come upon the spot at which Flatfoot had overtaken Nadara, but a few moments after the brute had dragged her away, and on the instant had sought a higher piece of ground from which he could overlook the tall grass. Nor had he been long in finding a spot that, coupled with his 6'2", brought his eyes above the level of the surrounding jungle. There he watched for a little until he discerned a movement of the grass tops at a little distance from him. After that it was but a matter of trailing. When Flatfoot saw what he took to be his enemy, he threw Nadara across his shoulder and started on a run in the opposite direction, at right angles to the way he had been going. The ruse proved good, for when Waldo came to the point at which he had figured his path would cross the caveman's, he found no sign of the latter, and in searching about to locate the trail lost many minutes of valuable time. But at last he came upon that which he sought, and with redoubled speed set out at a rapid run through the tall grasses. He had proceeded but a short distance when the trail broke suddenly into the open, close by the base of the cliffs that he had seen from the hill that had given him his fleeting glimpse of Nadara. Ahead of him he saw the two he sought, Nadara across the burly shoulders of Flatfoot, and the caveman was making for the caves that dotted the face of the cliff. Were he to reach these he might defend one of them against a single antagonist indefinitely. Chapter 11 Capture. Almost at the moment that Waldo emerged from the jungle, Nadara saw him, and with a lunge threw herself from Flatfoot's shoulder. The man turned with a fierce growl of rage, and his eyes fell upon the giant rushing toward them. The girl was now struggling madly to escape or delay her captor. There could be but one outcome, as Flatfoot knew. He must fight now, but the girl should never escape him. Raising the huge fist that had killed many a full-grown man with a single blow, he aimed a wicked one at the side of Nadara's head. The first one she dodged, and as the arm went up to strike again, Thander threw his spear arm far back and with a mighty forward surge, drove his light weapon across the 100 feet that separated him from Flatfoot. It was an awful risk. There was not a foot to spare between the hairy breast that was his target and the beautiful head of the fair captive. Should either move between the time the spear left his hand and the instant that it found its mark, it might pierce the one it had been sped to save. Flatfoot's fist was crashing down toward that lovely face at the instant that the spear found him, but he had moved just enough to place his arm before his breast so that it was the falling arm that received the weapon instead of the heart that it had been intended for. But it served its purpose. With a howl of pain and rage, Flatfoot, forgetful of the girl in the madness of his anger, dropped her and sprang toward Waldo. The latter had drawn his sword, naught but a sharpened stick of hard wood, and stood waiting to receive his foe. It was his first attempt to put either sword or shield into practical use, and he was anxious to discover their value. As Flatfoot came toward his antagonist, he pulled the spear from the muscles of his arm, and, stooping, gathered up one of the many rocks that lay scattered about at the base of the cliff. The caveman was roaring like a mad bull, hate and murder shot from his close-set eyes, his upper lip curled back, showing his fighting fangs, and a light froth flecked his bristling beard. Waldo was sure there had never existed a more fearsome creature, and he marveled that he was not afraid. The very thought of what the effect of this terrible monster's mad charge would have been upon him a short while ago brought a smile to his lips. At sight of that taunting smile, Flatfoot hurled the rock full at the maddening face. With a quick movement of his left arm, Waldo caught the missile on his buckler, from whence it dropped harmlessly to the ground. Flatfoot did not throw again, and an instant later he was upon the Bostonian, the pride and hope of the cultured and aristocratic Back Bay Smith-Joneses. When he reached for the agile, blond giant, he found a thin sheet of hide-covered twigs in his way, and when he tried to tear down this barrier, the point of a sharpened stick was thrust into his abdomen. This was no way to fight. Flatfoot was scandalized. He jumped back a few feet and glared at Waldo. Then he lowered his head and came at him once more with the very evident intention of rushing him off his feet by the very weight and impetuosity of his charge. This time the sharp stick slipped quickly over the top of the hide-covered atrocity and pierced Flatfoot's neck just where it joined his thick skull. Burying a foot of its point beneath the muscles of the shoulder, it brought a scream of pain and rage from the hairy beast. Before Waldo could withdraw his weapon from the tough sinews, Flatfoot had straightened up with a sudden jerk that snapped the sword short, leaving but a short stub in his antagonist's hand. Nadara had been watching the battle breathlessly, ready to flee should it turn against her champion, yet at the same time searching for an opportunity to aid him. Like Flatfoot, the girl had never before seen spear or sword or shield in use, and while she marveled at the advantage which they gave Thander, she became dubious as to the result of the encounter when she saw the sword broken, for the spear had been snapped into kindling wood by Flatfoot when he tore it from his arm. But Waldo still had his cudgel, fastened by a thong to his sword belt, and as the caveman rushed upon him again, he swung a mighty blow to the low, brutal forehead. Momentarily stunned, the fellow reeled backward for a step, and again Waldo wielded his new weapon. Flatfoot trembled, his knees smote together, he staggered drunkenly, and then, when Waldo looked to see him go down, the brute power that was in him, responding to nature's first law, sent him hurtling at the Bostonian's throat in the snarling, blind rage of the death-smitten beast. Catapulted by all the enormous strength of his mighty muscles, the squat, bear-like animal bore Waldo to earth, and at the same instant each found the other's throat with sinewy, vice-like fingers. They lay very still now, choking with firm, relentless clutch. Every ounce of muscle was needed, every grain of endurance. Waldo was suffering agonies after a moment of that awful death grip. He could feel his gasping, pain-racked lungs struggling for air. He tried to wriggle free from those horrible fingers, but not once did he loosen his own hold upon the throat of Flatfoot. Instead he tried to close a little tighter each second that he felt his own life ebbing. He became weaker and weaker. The pain was unendurable now. A haze obscured his vision, everything became black, his brain was whizzing about at frightful velocity within the awful darkness of his skull. The girl was bending close above them now, for both were struggling less violently. She had been minded to come to Thander's rescue when suddenly she recalled his desertion of her, and all the wild hatred of the primitive mind surged through her. Let him die, she thought. He had spurned her, cast her off, he looked down upon her. Well, let him take care of himself, then, and she turned deliberately away to leave the two men to decide the outcome of their own battle, and started back upon the trail in the direction of her tribe's village. But she had taken scarce a score of steps when something flamed up in her heart that withered the last remnant of her malice toward Thander. As she turned back again toward the combatants, she attempted to justify this new weakness by the thought that it was only fair that she should give the Yellow One aid in return for the aid that he had rendered her. That done, she could go on her way with a clear conscience. She wished never to see him again, but she could not have his blood upon her hands. At that thought she gave a little cry and ran to where the men lay. Both were almost quiet now, their struggles had nearly ceased. Just as she reached them, Flatfoot relaxed, his hand slipped from Waldo's throat and he lay entirely motionless. Then the fair giant struggled convulsively once or twice, he gasped, his eyes rolled up and set, and with a sudden twitching of his muscles he stiffened rigidly and was very still. Nadara gave one horrified look at the ghastly face of her champion, and fled into the jungle. She stumbled on for a quarter of a mile as fast as her tired limbs would carry her through the entangling grasses, and then she came to that which she sought, a little stream, winding slowly through the valley down toward the ocean. Dropping to her knees beside it, she filled her mouth with the refreshing water. In an instant she was up again and off in the direction from which she had just come. Throwing herself at Waldo's side, she wet his face with the water from her mouth. She chafed his hands, shook him, blew upon his face when the water was exhausted, and then, tears streaming from her eyes, she threw herself upon him, covering his face with kisses, and moaning inarticulate words of love and endearment that were half stifled by anguished sobs of grief. Suddenly her lamentations ceased as quickly as they had begun. She raised her head from where it had been buried beside the man's and looked intently into his face. Then she placed her ear upon his breast. With a delighted cry she resumed chafing his hands, for she had heard the beating of his heart. Presently Waldo gasped, and for a moment suffered the agonies of returning respiration. When he opened his eyes in consciousness he saw Nadara bending over him, a severely disinterested expression upon her beautiful face. He turned his head to one side, there lay Flatfoot quite dead. It was several moments before he could speak. Then he rose, very unsteadily, to his feet. "Nadara," he said, "Court lies dead beside the 3 great trees in the glade that is near the village that was Flatfoot's. Here is the dead body of Flatfoot, and about my loins hangs the pelt of Nagula, taken in fair fight. I have done all that you desired of me. I have tried to repay you for your kindness to me when I was a stranger in your land. I do not know why you should have tried to kill me while I battled with Court. No more do I know why you have allowed me to live today when it would have been so easy to have dispatched me as I lay unconscious here beside Flatfoot. I read dislike upon your face, and I am sorry, for I would have parted with you in friendship, so that when the time comes that I return to my own land I should be able to carry away with me only the pleasant memory of it. When we have rested and are refreshed I shall take you back to your father." All that had been surging to the girl's lips of love and gratitude from a heart that was filled with both was congealed by the cold tone which marked this dispassionate recital of the discharge of a moral obligation. Possibly Waldo's tone was colored by the vivid memory of the look of hate that he had seen in the girl's eyes at the instant that he went down before her missile as he battled with Court, for it was not even tinged with friendliness. And so the girl's manner was equally distant when she replied. In fact, it was even colder, for it was fraught with bitterness. "Thander owed nothing to Nadara," she said, "and though it matters not at all, it is only fair to say that the stone that struck you as you battled in the glade was intended for Court." Waldo's face brightened. A load that he had not realized lay there was lifted from his heart. "You did not want to hurt me, then?" he cried. "Why should I want to hurt you?" returned the girl. "I thought," and here Waldo spoiled the fair start they had made at a reconciliation, "I thought," he said, "that you were angry because I ran away from you after we had come to your village that time, months ago." Nadara's head went high and she laughed aloud. "I angry? I was surprised that you did not come to the village, but after an hour I had forgotten the matter. It was with difficulty that I recognized you when I next saw you, so utterly had the occurrence departed from my thoughts." Waldo wondered why he should feel such humiliation at this frank avowal. Of what moment to him was this girl's estimation of him? Why did he feel a flush suffuse his face at the knowledge that he was of so little moment to her that she had entirely forgotten him within a few months? Waldo was mortified and angry. He changed the subject brusquely. Hereafter he should eschew personalities. "Let us find a cave at a distance from the dead man," he said, "and there we may rest until you are ready to attempt the return journey." "I am ready now," replied Nadara, "nor do I need or desire your company. I can return alone, as I came." "No," remonstrated Waldo doggedly, "I shall go with you whether you wish it or not. I shall see you safely with your father." I promised him. Nadara had been delighted with the first clause of his reply, but when it became evident that his only desire to return with her was to fulfill a promise made her father, she became furious, though she was careful not to let him see it. "Very well," she replied, "you may come if you wish, though it is neither necessary nor as I would have it. I prefer being alone." "I shall not force my company upon you," said Waldo haughtily. "I can follow a few paces behind you." There was an injured air in his last words which did not escape the girl. She wondered if he really deserved the harsh attitude she had maintained. They found a cave a half-mile down the valley, where they took up their quarters against the time that Waldo should be rested, for the girl insisted that she was fully able to commence the return journey at once. The man knew better, and so he let her have it that the delay was on his account rather than hers, for he doubted her ability to cope with the hardships of the long journey without an interval for recuperation. The next morning found them both rested and in better spirits, so that there was no return to their acrimonious encounter of the previous day. As they walked out toward the forest that lay down the valley in the direction of the ocean, Waldo dropped a few paces behind the girl in polite deference to her expressed wish of the day before. As he walked, he watched the graceful movements of her lithe figure and the lines of her clear-cut profile as she turned her head this way and that in search of food. How beautiful she was! It was incredible that this wild cave girl should have greater beauty and a more regal carriage than the queens and beauties of civilization, and yet Waldo was forced to admit that he had never even dreamed, much less seen, such absolute physical perfection. He wished that he could say as much for her disposition, that was atrocious. It was unbelievable that such a wondrous exterior could harbor so much ingratitude and coldness. Presently they came among the trees where the ripe fruit hung, and as Waldo climbed nimbly among the branches and tossed the most luscious down to her, the girl, in her turn, watched him. She noted more closely the marvelous change that a few months had wrought. She had thought him wonderful before, but now he was a very god. She did not think just this, for she knew nothing of gods, other than the demons that were supposed to enter the bodies of the sick, but she thought of him as some superior creature, and then she ceased to feel aggrieved that he should care so little for her. He was not a man, he was something more than a man, and she had been very wicked to have treated him so shamefully. She would make amends. So she tried to be more kind thereafter, though there still remained a trace of aloofness. Together they sat upon the turf and ate their fruit, and as they ate they talked a little, for it is difficult for two young people to harbor animosity for a great time, especially when there is none other for them to talk to. "When you have returned with me to my father, Thunder," the girl asked, "where shall you go then?" "I shall return to the sea where I may watch for a ship to take me back to my own land," he replied. "I have seen but one ship in all my life," said Nadara, "and that was years ago. It was when we lived close by the big water that it stopped a long way from shore and sent many smaller boats to land. There were many men in the boats, and when they landed, my father and mother took me far into the forest away from the sea, and there we stayed for many days until the strangers had sailed. They wandered up and down the coast and came back into the forests and the jungles for a few miles. My mother said that they were searching for me, and that if they found me they would take me away. I was very much frightened." At the mention of her mother, Waldo recalled the little parcel that Nadara's father had given into his custody for the girl. He unfastened it from the thong that circled his waist, where it had hung beneath his panther skin garment. "Here is something your father asked me to bring you," he said, handing the package to Nadara. The girl took it and examined it as though it was entirely unfamiliar. "What is it?" she asked. "Your father did not say, other than that it contained articles that your mother wore when she died," he said tenderly, for a great pity had welled up in his heart for this poor, motherless girl. That my mother wore, Nadara repeated, her brows contracted in a puzzled frown. When my mother died, she wore nothing but a single garment of many small skins, very old and worn, and that was buried with her. I do not understand. She made no effort to open the package, but sat gazing far off toward the ocean, which was just visible through the trees, entirely absorbed in the reverie which Waldo's words had engendered. Could the thing that the old woman told me have been true? The girl mused half aloud. Could it have been because it was true that my mother fell upon her with tooth and nail until she had nearly killed her? I wonder if... But here she stopped, her eyes riveted in sudden fear and hopelessness upon a thing that she had just espied in the distance. A great lump rose in her throat, tears came to her eyes, and with them the full measure of realization of what that thing beyond the forest meant to her. She turned her eyes toward the man. He was sitting with bowed head, playing idly with a large beetle that he had penned within a tiny palisade of small twigs. At length he made an opening in the barrier. "Go your way, poor thing," he murmured. "Heaven knows I realize too well the horrors of captivity to keep any other creature from its fellows and its home." A choking sigh that was almost a sob racked the girl. At the sound Waldo looked up to see her pathetic, unhappy eyes upon him. Of a sudden there enveloped him a great desire to take her in his arms and comfort her. He knew not why she was unhappy, but her sorrow cried aloud to him as he thought simply to the protective instinct that was merely an attribute of his sex. Nadara raised her hands slowly and pointed through the trees. It was as though she had torn her heart from her breast, so harrowing she felt the consequences of her act would be, but it was for his sake, for the sake of the man she loved. As Waldo's eyes followed the direction of her pointing finger, he came suddenly to his feet with a wild cry of joy. Through the trees, out upon the shimmering surface of the placid sea, there lay a graceful, white yacht. "Thank God!" cried the man fervently, and sinking to his knees he raised his hands aloft toward the author of joy and sorrow. A moment later he sprang to his feet. "Home! Nadara! Home!" he cried. "Can't you realize it? I am going home. I am saved. Oh, Nadara, child, can't you realize what it means to me? Home. Home. Home." He had been looking toward the yacht as he spoke, but now he turned toward the girl. She was crouching upon the ground, her face in her hands, her slender figure shaken by convulsive tears. He came toward her and, kneeling, laid his hand upon her shoulder. "Nadara," he said gently. "Why do you cry, child? What is the matter?" But she only shook her head, moaning. He raised her to her feet, and as he supported her his arms circled her shoulders. "Tell me, Nadara, why you are unhappy?" he urged. But still she could not speak for sobbing, and only buried her face upon his breast. He was holding her very close now, and with the pressure of her body against his, a fire that, unknown, had been smoldering in his heart for months burst into sudden flame, and in the heat of it there were consumed the mists that had been before the eyes of his heart all that time. "Nadara," he asked in a very low voice, "is it because I am going that you cry?" But at that she pulled away from him, and through her tears her eyes blazed. "No," she cried. "I shall be glad when you have gone. I wish that you had never come. I hate you." She turned and fled back up the valley, forgetful of the little packet Thander had brought her, which lay forgotten upon the ground where she had dropped it. Without so much as a backward glance toward the yacht, Waldo was off in pursuit of her, but Nadara was as fleet as a hare, so that it was a much-winded Waldo who finally overhauled her halfway up the face of a cliff 2 miles from the ocean. "Go away," cried the girl. "Go back with your own kind, to your own home." Waldo did not answer. Waldo was no more. It was Thander, the caveman, who took Nadara in his strong arms and crushed her to him. "My girl," he cried. "My girl, I love you. And because I am a fool I did not learn until it was almost too late." He did not ask if she loved him, for he was Thander, the caveman. Nor, a moment later, did he need to ask, since her strong, Brown arms crept up about his neck and drew his lips down to hers. It was quite half an hour later before either thought of the yacht again. From where they stood upon the cliff's face they could see the ocean and the beach. Several boats were drawn up and a number of men were coming toward the forest. Presently they would discover the two upon the cliff. "We shall go back together now," said Thunder. "I am afraid," replied Nadara. For a time the man stood gazing at the dainty yacht, and far beyond it into the civilization which it represented, and he saw there suave men and sneering women, and among them was a slender brown beauty who shrank from the cruel glances of the women, and Waldo writhed at this and at the greedy eyes of the suave men as they appraised the girl, and he, too, was afraid. "Come," he said, taking Nadara by the hand, "let us hurry back into the hills before they discover us." Just as the men from the yacht, which Mr. John Alden Smith-Jones had dispatched to the South Seas in search of his missing son, emerged from the forest into a view of the valley and the cliffs, a caveman and his mate clambered over the brow of the latter and disappeared toward the hills beyond. It was nearly dusk as the searchers from the yacht were returning toward the beach. They had found no sign of human habitation in the little valley, nor anywhere along the coast that they had so carefully explored. The commander of the expedition, Captain Cecil Burlingham, a retired naval officer, was in advance. They had penetrated the woods nearly to the beach when his foot struck against a package wrapped in the skin of a small rodent. He stooped and picked it up. "Here is the first evidence that another human being than ourselves has ever set foot upon this island," he said as he cut the gut lacing with his pocket knife. Within the first wrapping he found a chamois bag such as women sometimes use to carry jewels about their persons. From this he emptied into his palm a dozen priceless rings, a few old-fashioned brooches, bracelets, and lockets. In one of the latter he discovered the ivory miniature of a woman, a very beautiful woman. In the other side of the locket was engraved, "To Eugénie Marie Céleste de la Valois, Countess of Crécy, from Henri, her husband. 17th January, 18. "Gad!" cried the old captain. "Now what do you make of that?" The Count and Countess of Crécy were returning to Paris from their honeymoon trip round the world in the steam yacht Dolphin nearly 20 years ago, and after they touched at Australia were never heard of again. What tragedy, what mystery, what romance might not these sparkling gems disclose had they but tongues? The Caveman. Part 2. Chapter 1. King Big Fist. Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, scion of the aristocratic house of the John Alden Smith-Jones of Boston, clambered up the rocky face of the precipitous cliff with the agility of a monkey. His right hand clasped the slim fingers of his half-naked mate, assisting her over the more dangerous or difficult stretches. At the summit the two turned their faces back toward the sea. Beyond the gently waving forest trees stretched the broad expanse of the shimmering ocean. In the foreground, upon the bosom of a tiny harbor, lay a graceful yacht, a beautiful toy it looked from the distance of the cliff top. For the first time the man obtained an unobstructed view of the craft. Before, when they first had discovered it, the boles of the trees had revealed it but in part. Now he saw it fully from stem to stern, with all its well-known graceful lines standing out distinctly against the deep blue of the water. The shock of recognition brought an involuntary exclamation from his lips. The girl looked quickly up into his face. "What is it, Thunder?" she asked. "What do you see?" "The yacht," he whispered. "It is the Priscilla, my father's. He is searching for me." "And you wish to go?" For some time he did not speak, stood there gazing at the distant yacht. And the young girl at his side remained quite motionless and silent, too, looking upon his face with a look of dumb misery upon her own. Quickly through the man's mind was running the gamut of his past. He recalled his careful and tender upbringing, the time, the money, the fond pride that had been expended upon his education. He thought of the result, the narrow-minded weakling egoist, the pusillanimous coward that had been washed from the deck of a passing steamer upon the sandy beach of this savage, forgotten shore. And yet it had been love, solicitous and tender, that had prompted his parents to their misguided efforts. He was their only son. They were doubtless grieving for him. They were no longer young, and in their declining years it appeared to him pathetic that they should be robbed of the happiness which he might bring them by returning to the old life. But could he ever return to the bookish existence that once had seemed so pleasant? Had not this brief year into which had been crowded so much of wild, primitive life made impossible a return to the narrow, self-centered existence? Had it not taught him that there was infinitely more in life than ever had been written into the dry and musty pages of books? It had taught him to want life at first hand, not through the proxy of the printed page. It and Nadara. He glanced toward the girl. Could he give her up? No, 1,000 times no. He read in her face the fear that lurked in her heart. No, he could not give her up. He owed to her all that he possessed, of which he was most proud: his mighty physique, his newfound courage, his woodcraft, his ability to cope, primitively, with the primitive world, her savage world which he had learned to love. No, he could not give her up, but what? His gaze lingered upon her sweet face. Slowly there sank into his understanding something of the reason for his love of this wild, half-savage cave girl other than the primitive passion of the sexes. He saw now not only the physical beauty of her face and figure, but the sweet, pure innocence of her girlishness, and most of all the wondrous tenderness of her love of him that was mirrored in her eyes. To remain and take her as his mate after manner and customs of her own people would reflect no shame upon himself or her, but was she not deserving of the highest honor that it lay within his power to offer at the altar of her love? She, his wonderful Nadara, must become his through the most solemn and dignified ceremony that civilized man had devised. What the young woman of his past life demanded was none too good for her. Again the girl voiced her question. You wish to go? Yes, Nadara, he replied, I must go back to my own people and you must go with me. Her face lighted with pleasure and happiness as she heard his last words, but the expression was quickly followed by one of doubt and fear. I am afraid, she said, but if you wish it I will go. You need not fear, Nadara. None will harm you by word or deed while Thanda is with you. Come, let us return to the sea and the yacht before she sails. Hand in hand they retraced their steps down the steep cliff, across the little valley toward the forest and the sea. Nadara walked very close to Thanda, her hand snuggled in his and her shoulder pressed tightly against his side, for she was afraid of the new life among the strange creatures of civilization. At the far side of the valley, just before one enters the forest, there grows a thick jungle of bamboo, really but a narrow strip, not more than 100 feet through at its greatest width, but so dense as to quite shut out from any view any creature even a few feet within its narrow, gloomy avenues. Into this the two plunged, Thanda in the lead, Nadara close behind him, stepping exactly in his footprints, an involuntary concession to training, for there was no need here either of deceiving a pursuer, or taking advantage of easier going. The trail was well marked and smooth, beaten by many a padded pad. It wound erratically, following the line of least resistance. It forked, and there were other trails which entered it from time to time, or crossed it. The 100 feet it traversed seemed so much more when measured by the trail. The two had come almost to the forest side of the jungle when a sharp turn in the path brought Thanda face to face with a huge bear-like man. The fellow wore a G-string of soft hide, and over one shoulder dangled an old and filthy leopard skin. Otherwise, he was naked. His thick, coarse hair was matted low over his forehead. The balance of his face was covered by a bushy red beard. At sight of Thanda his close-set, little eyes burned with sullen rage and cunning. From his thick lips burst a savage yell. It was the preliminary challenge. Ordinarily a certain amount of vituperation and coarse insults must pass between strangers meeting upon this inhospitable isle before they fly at one another's throat. I am Thurg, bellowed the brute. I can kill you, and then followed a volley of vulgar allusions to Thanda's possible origin and the origin of his ancestors. The bad men, whispered Nadara. With her words there swept into the man's memory the scene upon the face of the cliff that night a year before when, even in the throes of cowardly terror, he had turned to do battle with a huge caveman that the fellow might not prevent the escape of Nadara. He glanced at the right forearm of the creature who faced him. A smile touched Thanda's lips. The arm was crooked as from the knitting of a broken bone, poorly set. "You would kill Thander again?" he asked tauntingly, pointing toward the deformed member. Then came recognition to the red-rimmed eyes of Thurg, as, with another ferocious bellow, he launched himself toward the author of his old hurt. Thander met the charge with his short stick of pointed hard wood, his sword he called it. It entered the fleshy part of Thurg's breast, calling forth a howl of pain and a trickling stream of crimson. Thurg retreated. This was no way to fight. He was scandalized. For several minutes he stood glaring at his foe, screaming hideous threats and insults at him. Then once more he charged. Again the painful point entered his body, but this time he pressed in, clutching madly at the goad and for a hold upon Thander's body. The latter held Thurg at arm's length, prodding him with the fire-hardened point of his wooden sword. The caveman's little brain wondered at the skill and prowess of this stranger who had struck him a single blow with a cudgel many moons before and then run like a rabbit to escape his wrath. Why was it that he did not run now? What strange change had taken place in him? He had expected an easy victim when he finally had recognized his foe, but instead he had met with brawn and ferocity equal to his own and with a strange weapon, the like of which he had never before seen. Thander was puncturing him rapidly now, and Thurg was screaming in rage and suffering. Presently he could endure it no longer. With a sudden wrench he tore himself loose and ran, bellowing, through the jungle. Thander did not pursue. It was enough that he had rid himself of his enemy. He turned toward Nadara, smiling. "It will seem very tame in Boston," he said, but though she gave him an answering smile, she did not understand, for to her Boston was but another land of primeval forests and dense jungles, of hairy, battling men, and fierce beasts. At the edge of the forest they came again upon Thurg, but this time he was surrounded by a score of his burly tribesmen. Thander knew better than to pit himself against so many. Thurg came rushing down upon them, his fellows at his heels. In loud tones he screamed anew his challenge, and the beasts behind him took it up until the forest echoed to their hideous bellowing. He had seen Nadara as he had battled with Thander, and recognized her as the girl he had desired a year before, the girl whom this stranger had robbed him of. Now he was determined to wreak vengeance on the man and at the same time recapture the girl. Thander and Nadara turned back into the jungle where but a single enemy could attack them at a time in the narrow trails. Here they managed to elude pursuit for several hours, coming again into the forest nearly a mile below the beach where the Priscilla had lain at anchor. Thurg and his fellows had apparently given up the chase, they had neither seen nor heard aught of them for some time. Now the two hastened back through the wood to reach a point on the shore opposite the yacht. At last they came in sight of the harbor. Thander halted. A look of horror and disappointment supplanted the expression of pleasurable anticipation that had lighted his countenance. The yacht was not there. A mile out they discerned her, steaming rapidly north. Thander ran to the beach. He tore the Black Panther's hide from his shoulders, waving it frantically above his head, the while he shouted in futile endeavor to attract attention from the dwindling craft. Then, quite suddenly, he collapsed upon the beach, burying his face in his hands. Presently Nadara crept close to his side. Her soft arms encircled his shoulders as she drew his cheek close to hers in an attempt to comfort him. "Is it so terrible," she asked, "to be left here alone with your Nadara?" "It is not that," he answered. "If you were mine I should not care so much, but you cannot be mine until we have reached civilization and you have been made mine in accordance with the laws and customs of civilized men. And now who knows when another ship may come, if ever another will come?" "But I am yours, Thander," insisted the girl. "You are my man, you have told me that you love me, and I have replied that I would be your mate, who can give us to each other better than we can give ourselves." He tried, as best he could, to explain to her the marriage customs and ceremonies of his own world, but she found it difficult to understand how it might be that a stranger whom neither might possibly ever have seen before could make it right for her to love her Thander, or that it would be wrong for her to love him without the stranger's permission. To Thander the future looked most black and hopeless. With his sudden determination to take Nadara back to his own people he had been overwhelmed with a mad yearning for home. He realized that his past apathy to the idea of returning to Boston had been due solely to recollection of Boston as he had known it, Boston without Nadara, but now that she was to have gone back with him, Boston seemed the most desirable spot in the world. As he sat pondering the unfortunate happenings that had so delayed them that the yacht had sailed before they reached the shore, he also cast about for some plan to mitigate their disappointment. To live forever on this savage island did not seem such an appalling thing as it had a year before, but then he had not realized his love for the wild young creature at his side. Ah, if she could but be made his wife, then his exile here would be a happy rather than a doleful lot. What if he had been born here too? With the thought came a new idea that seemed to offer an avenue from his dilemma. Had he, too, been native-born, how would he have wed Nadara? Why, through the ceremony of their own people, of course. And if men and women were thus wed here, living together in faithfulness throughout their lives, what more sacred a union could civilization offer? He sprang to his feet. "Come, Nadara," he cried. "We shall return to your people, and there you shall become my wife." Nadara was puzzled, but she made no comment, content simply to leave the future to her lord and master, to do whatever would bring Thander the greatest happiness. The return to the dwellings of Nadara's people occupied 3 never-to-be-forgotten days. How different this journey by comparison with that of a year since, when the cave girl had been leading the terror-stricken Waldo Emerson in flight from the bad men toward, to him, an equally horrible fate at the hands of Court and Flatfoot. Then the forest glades echoed to the pads of fierce beasts and the stealthy passage of naked, human horrors. No twig snapped that did not portend instant and terrifying death. Now Court and Flatfoot were dead at the hands of the metamorphosed Waldo. The racking cough was gone. He had encountered the bad men and others like them and come away with honors. Even Nagula, the sleek, black devil cat of the hideous nights, no longer sent the slightest tremor through the rehabilitated nerves. Did not Thander wear Nagula's pelt about his shoulder and loins, a pelt that he had taken in hand-to-hand encounter with the dread beast? Slowly they walked beneath the shade of giant trees, beside pleasant streams, or, again, across open valleys where the grass grew knee-high and countless, perfumed wildflowers opened a pathway before their naked feet. At night they slept where night found them, sometimes in the deserted lair of a wild beast, or again perched among the branches of a spreading tree where parallel branches permitted the construction of rude platforms. And Thander was always most solicitous to see that Nadara's couch was of the softest grasses and that his own lay at a little distance from hers and in a position where he might best protect her from prowling beasts. Again was Nadara puzzled, but still she made no comment. Finally they came to her village. Several of the younger men came forth to meet them, but when they saw that the man was he who had slain Court, they bridled their truculence, all but one, Big Fist, who had assumed the role of king since Flatfoot had left. "I can kill you," he announced by way of greeting, "for I am Big Fist, and until Flatfoot returns I am king, and maybe afterward, for some day I shall kill Flatfoot." "I do not wish to fight you," replied Thander. "Already have I killed Court, and Flatfoot will return no more, for Flatfoot I have killed also. And I can kill Big Fist, but what is the use? Why should we fight? Let us be friends, for we must live together, and if we do not kill one another there will be more of us to meet the bad men, should they come, and kill them." When Big Fist heard that Flatfoot was dead and by the hand of this stranger, he pined less to measure his strength with that of the newcomer. He saw the knothole that the other offered, and promptly he sought to crawl through it, but with honor. "Very well," he said, "I shall not kill you, you need not be afraid. But you must know that I am king, and do as I say that you shall do." "Afraid?" Thander laughed. "You may be king," he said, "but as for doing what you say," and again he laughed. It was a very different Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones from the thing that the sea had spewed up 12 months before. Chapter 2: King Thander. The first thing that Thander did after he entered the village was to seek out Nadara's father. They found the old man in the poorest and least protected cave in the cliffside, exposed to the attack of the first prowling carnivore, or skulking foeman. He was sick, and there was none to care for him, but he did not complain. That was the way of his people. When a man became too old to be of service to the community, it were better that he died, and so they did nothing to delay the inevitable. When one became an absolute burden upon his fellows, it was customary to hasten the end. A carefully delivered blow with a heavy rock was calculated quickly to relieve the burdens of the community and the suffering of the invalid. Thander and Nadara came in and sat down beside him. The old fellow seemed glad to see them. "I am Thander," said the young man. "I wish to take your daughter as my mate." The old man looked at him questioningly for a moment. "You have killed Court and Flatfoot, who is to prevent you from taking Nadara?" "I wish to be joined to her with your permission and in accordance with the marriage ceremonies of your people," said Thander. The old man shook his head. "I do not understand you," he replied at last. "There are several fine caves that are not occupied. If you wish a better one, you have but to slay the present occupants if they do not get out when you tell them to, but I think they will get out when the slayer of Court and Flatfoot tells them to." "I am not worried about a cave," said Thander. "Tell me how men take their wives among you." "If they do not come with us willingly, we take them by the hair and drag them with us," replied Nadara's father. "My mate would not come with me," he continued, "and even after I had caught her and dragged her to my cave, she broke away and fled from me. But again I overhauled her, for when I was young none could run more swiftly, and this time I did what I should have done at first. I beat her upon the head until she went to sleep. When she awoke, she was in my own cave, and it was night, and she did not try to run away any more." For a long time Thander sat in thought. Presently he spoke, addressing Nadara. "In my country we do not take our wives in any such way, nor shall I take you thus. We must be married properly, according to the customs and laws of civilization." Nadara made no reply. To her it seemed that Thander must care very little for her. That was about the only explanation she could put upon his strange behavior. It made her sad. And then the other women would laugh at her, of that she was quite certain, and that, too, made her feel very badly. They would see that Thander did not want her. The old man, lying upon his scant bed of matted, filthy grasses, had heard the conversation. He was as much at sea as Nadara. At last he spoke, very feebly now, for rapidly he was nearing dissolution. "I am a very old man," he said to Thander. "I have not long to live. Before I die I should like to know that Nadara has a mate who will protect her. I love her," though he hesitated. "Though what?" asked Thander. "I have never told," whispered the old fellow. "My mate would not let me, but now that I am about to die it can do no harm. Nadara is not my daughter." The girl sprang to her feet. "Not your daughter? Then who am I?" "I do not know who you are, except that you are not even of my people. All I know I will tell you now before I die. Come close, for my voice is dying faster than my body." The young man and the girl came nearer to his side and, squatting there, leaned close that they might catch each faintly articulated syllable. "My mate and I," commenced the old man, "were childless, though many moons had passed since I took her to my cave. She wanted a little one, for thus only may women have aught upon which to lavish their love. We had been hunting together for several days alone and far from the village, for I was a great hunter when I was young, no greater ever lived among our people. And one day we came down to the great water, and there, a short distance from the shore, we saw a strange thing that floated upon the surface of the water, and when it was blown closer to us we saw that it was hollow and that in it were two people, a man and a woman. Both appeared to be dead. Finally I waded out to meet the thing, dragging it to shore, and there sure enough was a man and a woman, and the man was dead, quite dead. He must have been dead for a long time, but the woman was not dead. She was very fair, though her eyes and hair were black. We carried her ashore, and that night a little girl was born to her, but the woman died before morning. We put her back into the strange thing that had brought her, she and the dead man who had come with her, and shoved them off upon the great water, where the breeze, which runs away from the land twice each day, carried them out of sight, nor ever did we see them again. But before we sent them off, my mate took from the body of the woman her strange coverings and a little bag of skin which contained many sparkling stones of different colors and metals of yellow and white, made into things the purposes of which we could not guess. It was evident that the woman had come from a strange land, for she and all her belongings were unlike anything that either of us had ever seen before. She herself was different as Nadara is different. Nadara looks as her mother looked, for Nadara is the little babe that was born that night. We brought her back to our people after another moon, saying that she was born to my mate, but there was one woman who knew better, for it seemed that she had seen us when we found the boat, having been running away from a man who wanted her as his mate. But my mate did not want anyone to say that Nadara was not hers, for it is a great disgrace, as you well know, for a woman to be barren, and so she several times nearly killed this woman, who knew the truth, to keep her from telling it to the whole village. But I love Nadara as well as though she had been my own, and so I should like to see her well mated before I die. Thanda had gone white during the narration of the story of Nadara's birth. He could scarce restrain an impulse to go upon his knees and thank his God that he had harked to the call of his civilized training rather than have given in to the easier way, the way these primitive, beast-like people offered. Providence, he thought, must indeed have sent him here to rescue her. The old man, turning upon his rough palate, fastened his sunken eyes questioningly upon Thanda. Nadara, too, with parted lips waited for him to speak. The old man gasped for breath, there was a strange rattling sound in his throat. Thanda leaned above him, raising his head and shoulders slightly. The young man never had heard that sound before, but now that he heard it he needed no interpreter. The locust, rubbing his legs along his wings, startles the uninitiated into the belief that a hidden rattler lurks in the pathway, but when the great diamondback breaks forth in warning none mistakes him for a locust. And so it is with the death rattle in the human throat. Thanda knew that it was the end. He saw the old man's might effort to push back the grim reaper that he might speak once more. In the dying eyes were a question and a plea. Thanda could not misunderstand. He reached forward and took Nadara's hand. "In my own land we shall be mated," he said. "None other shall wed with Nadara, and as proof that she is Thanda's she shall wear this always," and from his finger he slipped a splendid solitaire to the third finger of Nadara's left hand. The old man saw. A look of relief and contentment that was almost a smile settled upon his features, as, with a gasping sigh, he sank limply into Thanda's arms, dead. That afternoon several of the younger men carried the body of Nadara's foster father to the top of the cliff, depositing it about half a mile from the caves. There was no ceremony. In it, though, Waldo Emerson saw what might have been the first human funeral cortege, simple, sensible and utilitarian, from which the human race has retrograded to the ostentatious, ridiculous, pestilent burials of present-day civilization. The young men, acting under Big Fist's orders, carried the worthless husk to a safe distance from the caves, leaving it there to the rapid disintegration provided by the beasts and birds of prey. Nadara wept, silently. An elderly lady with a single tooth, espying her, moaned in sympathy. Presently other females, attracted by the moaning, joined them, and, becoming affected by the strange hysteria to which womankind is heir, mingled their moans with those of the toothless one. Excited by their own noise they soon were shrieking and screaming in hideous chorus. Then came Big Fist and others of the men. The din annoyed them. They set upon the mourners with their fists and teeth, scattering them in all directions. This ended the festivities. Or would have had not Big Fist made the fatal mistake of launching a blow on Nadara. Thanda had been standing nearby looking with wonder upon the strange scene. He had noted the quiet grief of the young girl, real grief, and he had witnessed the hysterical variety of the mourners, no sham grief. Precisely, because they made no pretense to grief, it was noise to which they aspired. And as the fiendish din had set his own nerves on edge, he wondered not at all that Big Fist and the other men should take steps to quell the tumult. The female half-brutes were theirs, and Waldo Emerson had reverted sufficiently to the primitive to feel no incentive to interfere. But Nadara was not theirs, she was not of them, and even had she not belonged to him, the American would have felt bound to stand between her and the savage creatures among whom fate had cast her. That she did belong to him, however, sent him hot with the bloodlust of the killer as he sprang to intercept the rush of Big Fist toward her. Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones had learned nothing of the manly art of self-defense in that other life that had been so zealously guarded from the rude and vulgar. This was unfortunate, since it would have given him a great advantage over the man-brute. A single well-timed swing to that unguarded chin would have ended hostilities at once, but of hooks and jabs and jolts, scientific, Thunder knew nothing. Except for his crude weapons, he was a primeval in battle as his original anthropoid progenitor, and quite as often as not he forgot all about his sword, his knife, his bow and arrows and his spear when, half-stooped, he crouched to meet the charge of a foeman. Now he sprang for Big Fist's hairy throat. There was a sullen thud as the two bodies met, and then, rolling, biting and tearing, they struggled hither and thither upon the rocky ground at the base of the cliff. The other men desisted from their attack upon the women. The women ceased their vocal mourning. In a little circle they formed about the contestants, a circle which moved this way and that as the fighters moved, keeping them always in the center. Nadara forced her way through them to the front. She wished to be near Thunder. In her hand she carried a jagged bit of granite one could never tell. Big Fist was burly, mountainous, but Thunder was muscled like Nagula, the Black Panther. His movements were all grace and ease, but oh, so irresistible. A sudden and unexpected blow upon the side of Big Fist's head bent that bullet-shaped thing sideward with a jerk that almost dislocated the neck. Big Fist shrieked with the pain of it. Thunder, delighted by the result of the accidental blow, repeated it. Big Fist bellowed, agonized. He made a last supreme effort to close with his agile foeman, and succeeded. His teeth sought Thunder's throat, but the act brought his own jugular close to Thunder's jaws. The strong white teeth of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones closed upon it as naturally as though no countless ages had rolled their snail-like way between himself and the last of his progenitors to bury bloody fangs in the soft flesh of an antagonist. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.